Today we are joined by Joshua Morrow. Joshua is a professor at Georgia College and State University, and his research centers around the lost cause and the historical memory of the Confederacy. The following discussion unveils the myths and narratives surrounding the Confederacy and the Civil War and definitively answers one of the most pressing and debated questions in American history. Why did the South secede from the Union? Enjoy the episode. Joshua, welcome to American History Gazette.
Glad to be here.
All right, now I'll start off with the burning question, the obvious question. Why did the South secede from the Union?
Yes, that is, again, sort of the driving question of all of this. I think the main, simplest reason, of course, is the idea of slavery. That is the driving force of it. Of course, if you ask them, they would always say that it was primarily states' rights, but the question mostly comes down to states' rights to maintain slavery. If you want to get really specific, it's probably the idea that slavery needs to expand into the West to be able to continue to exist as an institution. One of the big things that kind of drove a lot of secessionist thought, and ironically sort of don't talk about as much, is the growth of cotton actually deprived the soil of a lot of its nutrients, and there was a fear that eventually cotton would dry up and that they would ultimately not be able to maintain this cotton kingdom slave empire of sorts. So they believed that they needed to expand into the West to have more fertile farmland, to be able to continue to grow cotton, and of course allow the institution of slavery to continue to grow. One of the sort of the big drawback from that, of course, is what leads to the major debate over whether or not it's legal to do this, whether or not we should do this. And results on that were surprisingly mixed, I think, in a lot of ways that people are maybe not as familiar with. But it is something that does seem to be, again, very rooted in the ideas of slavery and the importance of slavery to the Southern ecosystem, the Southern economy. And in some ways, it kind of even relates to almost even the agricultural aspect of the South and sort of the soil erosion. It's all very connected in some very interesting ways.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It seems that it was fought more so over the expansion of slavery versus slavery itself as an institution already ingrained in the South, because I know especially Abraham Lincoln, a lot of people, they were like, we're not going to take away your slaves. We just want to stop the spread of slavery. There is sort of three narratives when it comes to the reason for secession. Slavery, obviously being the one that you just said, states' rights, and the lost cause. So I'd like to flesh out these arguments one at a time. Obviously, we just got into slavery, but what was the argument behind the states' rights argument? What's the narrative behind that?
One of the big things that I would say kind of relates to the idea of states' rights is the feeling that, one, it kind of relates to Northern business interests. Much of it kind of goes down to sort of the question between which version of society, the Northern society, which is becoming more industrialized, or the Southern economy, which is more agricultural, which is going to be the one that's going to sort of determine the future of the United States. Is it going to be agricultural? Is it going to be sort of industrial? And that kind of goes down to sort of the idea of what exactly is the role of the states. And again, this is one of the biggest points really in American history. This comes back, I bring it up in class all the time. It's the idea that essentially the core of American politics, where it all started, is the debate between national government superiority over state superiority. That is what started the first political parties, and in some ways it's still driving politics even today, is what should be the experience and the skills, sort of what should be the focus of the federal government, or should it be on the states? And of course, Southern states are much more localized in their sense. They believe that the ideal society is somebody who runs your state, county, local elections, are people whom you know personally. You know them, they know you know each other, as opposed to this large, faceless, in a way, sort of monolithic government that is driving so much of what they perceive to be the national government, who doesn't even know or care about you or your interests. And that is sort of the core of it. It's always been around. It starts literally during Washington's presidency. It's a big part of some of the controversies that erupt during his presidency. and it kind of comes to encapsulate the agrarian worldview of the South. So the states' rights, the idea that states should have priority, that the United States is, in fact, sort of the United States. It's a nation made up of states, as opposed to the more northern approach, which is it is a nation that has states in it. And many of these southern politicians believed that if their needs were not being met by the federal government, they had the legal justification to leave the Union. And that is one of the things that they sort of argued. Again, states' rights, but again, slavery is still obviously core to this, but it is sort of the idea that our view of what the United States should be is different and in some ways superior to what the northern government wants. That is kind of the main justification, that the power and impetus needs to be on the states as opposed to the federal government.
And what are some of the states' rights that the South was protesting? Obviously, the major one was their states' rights to own slaves, but it's a little more nuanced than that. So what are some of the states' rights that they were arguing were being violated?
Well, some of the ones that they were kind of arguing is, again, sort of instances of federal power. It goes back, way back. I guess I'll go back to sort of the idea of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, 1798, 1799. That's where you start to see really the origin of this. It is where, during John Adams' presidency, he introduces the very controversial Alien and Sedition Acts. And again, this is still sort of the thing that kind of captures, maybe pollutes Adams' legacy a little bit. The idea that people can be sort of deported for criticizing the federal government. Well, Jefferson, Madison really hated this because, again, they're people who believe strongly in the power of the states. So together they craft these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions saying that if the states do not like a law, they should have the right to overturn that law. And that is the thing that kind of gives credence to this idea of nullification. And nullification is, in many ways, kind of the cornerstone of the secessionist thought. The idea that a state has a right, because again, in their mind, states are superior to the federal government, that the states themselves have a right to withdraw whenever their needs are not being met. This comes up quite frequently during Andrew Jackson's presidency. He has several nullification crises, particularly involving South Carolina, which is obviously the most adamant in its protection of the idea of slavery. For example, because they are the only state that had, at least at this point, I think Georgia to some extent as well, they had essentially a African American or sort of person of African descent majority. There are more people of African descent in the state than there were white Americans. And because of that, that is where slavery tended to be the harshest, because they needed to maintain control. Because if they didn't have control, they're outnumbered. Power dynamics, there's a huge power dynamic here. So they have to create laws to be able to put them, sort of keep them in their place. And that does lead to them being the ones who are most heavily invested in the idea of nullification, most heavily invested in the idea of secession. There is a reason that they are the first state to secede. They tried this a couple times during Andrew Jackson's tenure. And Jackson, again, he introduces a tariff, proves to be wildly unpopular. Tariff, of course, being sort of a tax on imports. Really kind of hurts the South a lot in particular. Very good for northern businesses, not so much for southern agrarians. And it does kind of essentially upset South Carolina. They say that we are refusing to accept this law. Jackson almost declares, sends the troops in, like there's almost a conflict right then and there. They're able to prevent it from happening, but it does sort of set a precedent in many ways for states' rights to secede due to this idea of nullification, which is the big thing that really, again, sort of drives a lot of this idea. The guy who kind of becomes the mouthpiece of this is, of course, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Ironically, Andrew Jackson's vice president. Really awkward dinners, quite literally. There's a whole dinner where they are toasting each other and like throwing zingers at each other. It's wild. But he ends up becoming sort of the patron saint of the Confederacy, even though he himself never lived long enough to actually see the Confederacy. He is the one that kind of gives birth to the ideology that becomes the Confederate ideology. So I would argue that's kind of the very long, circuitous route to sort of the states' rights question.
That's insane that African Americans and slaves outnumbered white men in South Carolina and maybe Georgia at that time, because, obviously the colonies, the United States at this time was a very white majority nation. So it's insane. It shows you how prominent slavery was in these areas. And I think power dynamic is a great way to put it, because they had to maintain control, because if there was a slave rebellion, it's very possible that slaves could have overthrown their masters. But this really all goes back to the Jeffersonian versus Hamiltonian argument back at the founding of our country. Jeffersonian's view of state power, Hamilton's view of a strong centralized federal government. But you would definitively say that the South kind of adopted this Jeffersonian view of culture and state power, and the North was kind of a Hamiltonian hotbed.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fairly accurate way of putting it. Again, Hamilton, again, sort of Hamiltonian in the sense, yes, I would agree, sort of the Federalist approach, sort of the Federalist versus anti-Federalist. That's what the first political parties were founded on. Still a big part of what the political parties are still heavily invested in even now. That is one of the main things that I think still comes up in politics quite often. If you look at sort of the reaction to some of the Supreme Court decisions, you do start to still see that thread has kind of always continued through American history, and I don't see it really ever fading away. It's kind of a key part of American politics, because it is, in some ways, the origin of American politics is this question.
Yeah, for sure. And it shows the division between the North and the South, starting way back at the founding of our country, and not necessarily just about slavery, but a complete difference in political philosophy and the way they view an ideal America. But going on to our next argument of secession, and this is something you've written about extensively, is the lost cause, and this sort of propagated myth that has permeated throughout American history. So what exactly is the lost cause?
Yeah, excellent question. This is something that people are sort of still heavily debated even today. Well, essentially it is a belief that was propagated by people, well, I'll talk more about that in a moment, about the idea that the South was justified in what they did, that we didn't win the war, but we didn't lose. That is the idea that just because we were not successful doesn't mean that we were not able to sort of fight the gallant fight. That is the big thing. And this goes back to, in some ways, a big key debate. I think a big idea comes up in a lot of very famous scholars. In particular, Bertram Wyatt Brown wrote an excellent book on Southern honor, literally called, I think, Southern Honor. And he goes back to these ideas that it's a very chivalric society, almost medieval in some ways, sort of in its conceptions, at least when it comes to the understandings of masculinity, the understandings of femininity. It's very much kind of a continuation of that cultural idea. And one of the things that comes down to it is, how do we, as a society, protect the masculinity of our men when they are not successful in a conflict? When they are not able to be sort of these champions, these heroes, people who are successful, how do we let them down, sort of let them be able to continue to exist without feeling like a failure? That is one of the big things that drives a lot of this. And because of that, again, it's a very heavily gendered ideology, again, sort of protecting masculinity, but is also primarily driven by women. So it is a feminine-driven ideology designed to prop up masculinity. One of the big things, again, that they often do, these sort of descendants of these Confederate veterans, they would quite literally, when the politicians were doing something they didn't like, they would say, hey, your Confederate forefathers would be disappointed in you because they were real men and you're not. So then they would say that, and then they're like, oh, well, yeah, of course we're going to approve all the stuff that you want. And it works. Like, they quite literally shamed them into saying, well, if you were a real man, you would do this. And it allows them to actually be very successful. They start sort of rewriting the story saying, oh yeah, the war, it wasn't about slavery. They said that it's only about states' rights. That's the idea. Of course, when you ask them states' rights to do what, they kind of get a little iffy. But it is very much a society-wide movement where they are reaching down into every level. There's no part of society that in some way doesn't play into this lost cause ideology. And it is rewriting the story saying, hey, we were all good people. Masters treated slaves kindly. Slaves loved being slaves, which again, if you look at the actual historical records, why are they running away if they love being slaves? Why are they having rebellions if they love being slaves? So it doesn't really line up with the historicity of it, but they are rewriting the history of it. And in many ways, this becomes the history that people study. That's one of the main things of a lot of my research is focusing on their relationship with education, how they are able to get it into the textbooks, and then textbooks not just in the South, but in the North as well. And many of the people who end up sort of being taught the lost cause, they end up becoming the people who are the politicians during the Civil Rights era, the ones who are against integration, against and for segregation. They are the ones who are brought up on this belief. So it's always important to, because again, they start them with kids. They have whole organizations dedicated to teaching kids the holy cause of the Confederacy. They literally compare Jefferson Davis to Jesus, like multiple times. They call him the sufferer of the South because he suffered on the sort of pilloried in a way, even though if you actually look at the records of people during the war, a lot of people really hated Jefferson Davis. But then years later, they're like, oh, he was the greatest guy who ever lived. Like, they completely changed their whole dynamic on him. And in the process, they also kind of forget, because it is remembering a specific point of view. Again, remembering that we are the good guys, we're not the baddies. But also the idea that really you have that core concept that not everybody in the South supported the Confederacy. This is something that I hope we'll be able to come back to when we talk a bit more about Lincoln. But there are a lot of people there who are pro-Union. Again, even my own family. I had family who were Southerners who were Unionists. They fought for the Union from Tennessee. So there are people who are very much not part of this Confederate war machine, but they're also completely forgotten about when it comes to the actual history of the war, because whenever the story comes out, it's all Southerners supported the Confederacy. They all loved it. The people who were quite literally leading raids, attacks against other Southerners, completely forgotten. Their stories are not remembered. They've tried to recover them, but in many ways, they're just not something that is easily captured, because they are deliberately chosen to forget. Because the average person doesn't like complexity. Historians love complexity. That's the thing that drives us. The nuances, the levels of gray. And that's one of the reasons why they wanted to create a nice, pat, monolithic version of the South. Everyone loved slavery. Slavery wasn't bad. Everybody was good. Nobody liked the North. And that's just not the way it is. That's just not the reality of the situation. But it's still the thing that most people believe. Southern Unionists are still very rarely discussed. There have been new literature on them in the last decade or so, but they're actively recovering these stories, which I think is important to really be able to understand and grasp the real complexity of the Civil War beyond just all Northerners supported the North, which they didn't, and all Southerners supported the South, which they didn't. I think it is important to recover some of those stories that have been deliberately forgotten due to sort of the efforts of these, again, primarily women who are leading these movements.
Yeah, I agree. I hate that this has become sort of a black and white issue in mainstream narratives. This is such a complex and nuanced conflict in American history, like you just said. But when it comes to the lost cause, it seems that part of this was addressing an identity crisis following the Civil War of the South, which I do think there is some validity to and some good intention, because I know a part of Reconstruction was bringing the North and South back together. So you don't want half of the population, being the South, to feel this animosity and this burden and this guilt and this sense of defeat. You want them to come back into the Union. You want to welcome them so you can be a strong, united nation once again. But on the flip side of that, it's obviously not a good thing to rewrite history that didn't necessarily happen or didn't play out that way, and rewriting the history books and permeating propaganda throughout history.
Yeah, especially since so much of the ideology that ends up fueling the lost cause is inherently sort of white supremacist in its way. It is primarily designed to strip power away from African Americans. That is one of the main focuses of it. So I think that is, again, sort of has a very negative connotation. Again, it is a defense mechanism. I think that's what came to my mind when you were talking about it. It is something that they do to protect themselves. And it's something that, again, serves a political purpose. Because women at the time were not able to vote. Again, they don't get the vote till much later. 1890s is really when this lost cause is started. But the thing is that kind of drives a lot of that is the idea that we want to make sure that future generations remember it the correct way, to remember it sort of as a protection of our values, and it becomes very closely linked to the original incarnation, particularly of the Democratic Party, the one that, again, sort of not necessarily the Democratic Party of today, which, again, very different, but the Democratic Party of the South, the party that dominated the South's politics from like 1820s up to about 1960s. That is the era of these politicians that are able to become powerful because they cater to these people who are sort of these lost causers, these neo-Confederates, if you will. And women, again, they're not able to vote, but using this, because the only thing that women were traditionally allowed to do, they were only really able to sort of take care of the house, take care of their children, their husband, and the elderly. That's the three things that women are allowed to do. Even Southern women, that's kind of the limitations placed upon them, this sort of idea of the separate spheres, the public sphere versus the private sphere. And ultimately, this is the thing that allows them to have political power, although it's indirect political power. What they're doing is they are able to lobby these politicians to give them, let's build a home for Confederate veterans. Let's build a Confederate monument. They're able to get money and support from the politicians to do this because they are saying this is an extension of our duties. We are protecting our fathers. We are protecting the legacy of our sons. It's something that is inherently rooted in the jobs, the duties that women are expected to do in society. So ultimately, they're able to have political power without the right to vote simply by expanding their already sort of assigned duties. And I think that's something really important because it is, again, the 1990s, this is the period of time where you see huge organizations, women creating massive organizations, whether it's Daughters of the American Revolution, which have been around before that, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. You see like all these organizations that exist to promote, help, do whatever they can, benevolent organizations. And that is a form of politics. It's a form of sort of the politics of the people, as opposed to being able to vote directly, but they are able to express power in a way that women were not traditionally allowed to express, at least until they get the right to vote. So it's something that in some ways is a major part of women's history that, again, is often sort of overlooked. Again, sort of not necessarily always a positive version of women history, because some of the stuff that they're using it for, but it is a sort of advancement of what women are and what women are expected to be, at least within the Southern context.
So this myth, you mentioned it kind of stems from the 1890s, and it's largely driven by women, the daughters of the Confederacy. So kind of explain a little more how this lost cause myth kind of began and permeated into the Southern culture and American history.
Great question. So it kind of started in the 1890s again. That's the point where they realized a lot of these Confederate veterans are dying off, or they're at least getting very old. So the very first groups were these called Ladies' Memorial Associations. They kind of start in the right after sort of Reconstruction, and they eventually do become the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This is something written about a lot by Karen Cox, excellent historian, fantastic writer, who dives into a lot of these ideas. With her book Dixie's Daughters, it's a sort of key book to a lot of what I do. And I think one of the things that sort of drives it so much is the idea that, again, we want to sort of protect them because they're no longer going to be here. Again, men are, at least at this point, we're expected to be inherently political. They are people that they can vote, that if they are sort of saying, hey, the Confederacy was right, then the North would get sort of pay attention to that and be like, maybe not. They would crack down on them a little bit. But because women were not expected to have political power, that therefore them saying these things were not political. And that is one of the big things, because They said, oh, well, they're just being women. They're just talking about things that matter to them. That's not political because they don't recognize it as that. So they're allowed to keep these ideas going in ways that men are not able to. And whenever men do, they are saying we're doing it by catering to our women. So that's one of the things that drives a lot of it. That's kind of how it starts. It starts out wanting to be primarily kind of, I don't want to say like death focused, but it's primarily focused on graves, graveyards, cemeteries. That's where it starts. The memorials sort of for these people who are dead. But then it starts to become less about honoring the dead and more about honoring the still living veterans. And then it becomes more about how, once all the veterans are gone, it becomes how do we continue to protect them even though they're dead? How do we protect their legacy? So it's no longer about taking care of them, giving them food, giving them a place to stay. It becomes how do we protect this idea to protect that they are the real masculine men, sort of through those rose-colored glasses that our men today are not. That's kind of the way that it starts. But then it becomes, they get involved, because one of the other things that women are expected to be involved in, again, the idea of Republican motherhood, they are seen as transmitters of culture. They're the ones that are seen as being able to teach children. It's one of the reasons why teaching, at least sort of at the elementary school through high school level, was always sort of predominantly seen as female in a lot of ways, is sort of an expectation that women are the ones who are doing this. So women, again, members of these organizations, they are the ones that are very active in sort of like school boards. They're very active in sort of, even if they're not on the school boards, at least working with the school boards. They're very interested in what's being taught. They create whole committees that exist to monitor every textbook being released in the country to determine if it's fair to the South. And then they will lobby the schools to adapt this book, to throw out this other book. There are instances of them saying, this is a good book, but except for these 2 pages, tape those 2 pages together so that students can't read them. Like, they would literally do things like that. And it creates, and many times, again, a lot of these women become the teachers. There is one of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, one of the things they did is they actually created a scholarship fund to send one of their members of their organization to a school to get an education to become a teacher so that she could teach the students this lost cause idea. So it becomes, again, very involved with sort of starting on the ground level. They have meetings where they quite literally hand them these pseudo-religious documents, these Confederate catechisms, where you're supposed to just read the catechism. You're supposed to just recite everything in there. No variations allowed. Question is, why did the South secede? And you had to give them the exact answer in the book, and they would repeat that, drill it into you. If you got it word for word, you'd get a prize. So, of course, that gave kids an incentive to read it, internalize it, and not think critically about it. And then, again, they get it at home. They get it from their churches. Sometimes they get it from their schools. And eventually they grow up to believe that this is 100% what it was about. There's a great book that I often have my students read because I think it really dives into all of this, and that is Apostles of Disunion by Charles B. Dew, who himself was a strong believer in the lost cause. He grew up as a son of the Confederacy, as a son of the South, and he actually put up like a Confederate flag in his college dorm until he started thinking about it a little bit more deeply, diving actually into the words of a lot of these people who are actively promoting the lost cause, and he starts to realize that this is sort of about slavery, that kind of everything that I've known, everything that society has taught me has sort of misled a little bit about what the actual cause is, sort of the question about it. So then he writes the Apostles of Disunion, that I think is one of the greatest books, really, that kind of goes, sort of dissects the idea of states' rights argument versus sort of the slavery argument, because he focuses on the secession commissioners who actively went around the South saying, hey, secede from the country because we don't want them to take our slaves. Like, word for word, they all saying, hey, Georgia, you should leave too because you don't want them to take your slaves, do you? We like slavery. That's like, and then of course, years later, they said, oh, don't look at those documents, don't look at it, those ones don't matter, they were taken out of context, things like that. They sort of hide the evidence, or at least try to talk over it, because, you know, the actual reality is, if you look at their actual words, they're much more upfront about it. even the people who were saying, yeah, it's about slavery, 20 years later after the war is over, they come out and say, yeah, it was never about slavery. Like, they completely changed their mind to sort of tie into this argument. So I think it is something that kind of starts out, again, primarily women driven, but focused primarily on children. That's where it starts. And then once you have a kid, sort of get the child invested, it becomes much harder to sort of unlearn that as you go.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It seems that it was sort of a way for women to express their political view in a society that suppressed female politics. But what's interesting here, at least something that I noticed when looking at the reason for secession, and you have the lost cause myth, you have the slavery argument, all these different arguments in this foggy history, is you can actually look at what the Confederacy said was their reason for secession when they seceded. And that, to me, was like, if anyone wants an answer to this question, just look at who the actual secessionists were saying their reason for secession was. And we'll get into that here in a little bit. But I want to ask you this question. I'm a huge fan in alternate history and what historical figures would have thought about events today or events that they didn't see in their lifetime. And we mentioned that the South was sort of this Jeffersonian culture and Jeffersonian political philosophy that they had. So I'm interested to hear, what do you think Thomas Jefferson would have thought about secession had he been alive at that time?
Okay, so Jefferson, fascinating guy. I think one of the most interesting sort of American politicians, because he's so inconsistent on pretty much everything. He's somebody who's like, oh, I hate slavery, but also he's like, I hate slavery, but I'm never going to free my slaves. And then he's like, I think they're inferior, but then he's like, but I think they can be great. So it makes there's like literally, I always sort of point out in class, there's a whole Wikipedia article about Jefferson's view on slavery because it makes literally no sense. So it's always kind of hard to sort of justify or even guess what Jefferson would think. I mean, in some ways, obviously, since he is the guy who sort of promotes this nullification concept, he would be somebody who, at least in theory, would be aware of it. Again, he was somebody who believed very firmly in the maintaining of the Union. That was still the thing that he did. He says, right to nullify laws does not mean right to secede from the country. So even though he was somebody who kind of gave credence to that eventually, once it sort of gets taken away after he dies, sort of changes, I don't necessarily think that he would have been pro-secession. I think he would have stayed pro-nullification. I think he may have understood the reason for doing so, but I still think he was somebody who would believe in the power primarily of the federal government. I think even though, again, he is a local government guy, I think he'd be somebody who would still want to promote the Union. He would probably be one of those, like Robert E. Lee's. He'd be like one of those guys, like, I'm in favor of the Union until, Virginia secedes, then he'd probably become a Confederate. That's, again, sort of just my thoughts, but he is sort of, again, so inconsistent. But I think he could go either way. I think he would understand the logic and sort of the reasoning behind it, but I still think that he was somebody who would do everything possible to maintain the Union until it absolutely seems like there's no possibility. Then he might become a Confederate. But again, it's so hard to sort of grapple with any of that because of just Jefferson's very interesting personality.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, I know, but he's such a fascinating character, and he is pretty inconsistent. He does contradict himself a lot. He advocated for states' rights and states' power, but then exercised one of the most powerful executive powers during his presidency in the Louisiana Purchase, which ultimately was a net benefit for the United States, but he exercised extreme executive power in that, which contradicts his whole political philosophy, which is interesting. But I'd like to backtrack now a little bit to see how we got here. So, backtracking to 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise, which at this time, the issue was stopping the spread of slavery, and Missouri is admitted into the Union, and it's a question of, are we going to allow slavery in Missouri? So they come to the compromise that we're going to allow slavery in Missouri, but admit Maine as a free state to maintain this balance, because they wanted a balance between slave states and free states, so there's equal representation in government. And then, Fast forward 30 years, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1850, which basically nullifies all of that and contradicts all of that, because the Missouri Compromise said we're not going to have slaves north of this line, which kind of drew a line through the center of continental U.S., and Kansas and Nebraska Act were north of that. And they get admitted, and this idea of popular sovereignty comes about, where let's let the people of the states decide if they want slavery. And this ultimately led to a lot of conflict, what would become known as Bleeding Kansas. There was, armed, violent conflict in Kansas over this issue. So just walk me through the Kansas-Nebraska Act and how that may have contributed to the secession we see 10 years later.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so one of the main things is, again, sort of talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You kind of have to talk about the guy who creates it, of course, which is Stephen Douglas. Interesting guy, runs for president in 1860, kind of in some ways boosts Lincoln's career. I don't think you would have a very successful Lincoln if he didn't debate Douglas, so I think in some ways he kind of proves to be maybe one of the great historical stepping stones in some ways.
Yeah, I know their debates in 1858, I think it was, their midterm debates is what really propelled Lincoln's popularity and national fame.
Yeah, absolutely. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are huge there. But yeah, I think it's interesting because he is a Northerner, but he is a Northern Democrat. So he's somebody that doesn't really care. He's like, yeah, slavery, fine, whatever. But he's primarily trying to maintain the consistency, in a way, of the Democratic Party. Because he knows if you split the vote, Republicans are going to win, or the Whigs, depending, I guess, sort of, Whigs are kind of around at this point still. But he's like, you're going to split the party, the other guys are going to win. So he's trying to find a way to appeal to everyone. And the idea of popular sovereignty essentially says, hey, if you vote, the people of the state themselves should be able to vote to determine whether or not they should allow slavery. And in some ways, again, that is the idea of popular sovereignty. Completely overrides the Missouri Compromise, which says, north of this line, no slavery. South of this line, yeah, slavery. But it's really the idea sort of that, anybody can decide becomes very complicated. That's what leads into, again, like you said, Bleeding Kansas, where a bunch of people who were not even from Kansas moved into Kansas solely with the purpose of voting to make it a slave state or a free state. You get two rival governments, one that's a pro-slavery government, one that's a anti-slavery government. Chaos breaks out. John Brown kills a bunch of people. It's just chaos. Literally, Bleeding Kansas is sort of chaos. And obviously doesn't really improve relations any, because the whole idea is, how do we keep the country together? And it's really hard to keep the country together when you have people who are literally murdering each other and voting basically illegally here. So it does create more, I guess, issues than it ultimately resolves, because now people are feeling, hey, this is sort of, with the addition of sort of eventually comes about the more stringent fugitive slave law, it becomes chaos. It becomes so chaotic that the tensions rapidly increase. And president at the time, James Buchanan, his policy is, it'll work out. He doesn't do anything.
The greatest president of all time.
Oh, of course, yeah. Right up there with Andrew Johnson. There is a reason he is considered to be sort of one of the worst presidents of all time. He does nothing. His whole policy is it'll be fine. I mean, there's even a movie, again, I've not seen it, but I think it's called something about Buchanan, Raising Buchanan, something like that, where a woman who wants to become famous, so she steals the body of James Buchanan and then finds out that literally nobody wants it back. So it's one of those things where it's just his legacy is non-existent practically. But it's, yeah, so he doesn't really do anything. The secession, we often say, oh, it's Lincoln's election, which it is, but Buchanan was still president when the state started seceding. Lincoln hadn't taken office yet. He could have done something about it, and he didn't. He's just let Lincoln deal with it. And then he kind of disappears. He goes off into the ether, and we don't ever hear about him again as much. So he doesn't really he's not able to sort of manage a lot of this, sort of the fallout of Kansas-Nebraska, which is slightly before him, but you don't really see sort of any real engagement. He's like, yeah, stick our head under the sand and it will get better. And obviously, that doesn't solve anything. Tensions get worse to the point where Lincoln getting elected literally breaks the country. Literally, like, it falls completely apart. And I think that's one of the main themes of a lot of the ideas here.
Yeah, when it comes to Kansas, I mean, drafting two different state constitutions is always a great way to start, unifying the country and start a state on their way to being a unified, strong state. It's amazing. But James Buchanan, like you said, does nothing. And this sets the stage for the presidential election of 1860, in which Abraham Lincoln wins and ignites this conflict, really. So why was Lincoln's election a catalyst for secession, and what were his views on slavery and secession and things of that nature?
Yeah, great question. So I kind of want to talk about the election of 1860, because that is, in many ways, probably the most important election in American history, because you have four people running. Again, it's not just Lincoln. There are three other guys who are running here, because you have one candidate, sort of John Bell, Constitutional Unionist Party. He is the one that's running that says, let's do whatever we can to preserve the Union. We have to let the Union continue to exist, whether that's with slavery, whether that's without slavery. We have to let it exist. That is his focus. And John Bell, again, people don't think about him as much. Again, he's sort of the fourth candidate, nobody really expected him to win, but he is an alternative. Because the other major candidate, one of the other major candidates, is John Breckinridge. And he is somebody who, quite literally, when he's running for office, says, hey, maybe if our needs aren't met, we should secede. Like, he's saying that before the election even happens. So people who are more likely to be pro-secessionist Southerners are voting for him. But the constitutional unionists, the people who do say, like, hey, we want to keep the country together, vote for John Bell. And what's interesting here is that John Bell does really, really well. Again, he doesn't win too many states, but he's very close. He's basically a close second in every single southern state. I think, because again, I teach in Georgia, I live in Georgia, I think Georgia, 47% of the voters in Georgia, I believe, voted for John Bell. So that means 47% of the people in Georgia, right up to the edge of secession, don't actually want to secede. The fact that he does so well there, and he does very well in a lot of states, shows that, again, it's not this monolithic, everybody wants to secede. So the 1860 election's really important there. Stephen Douglas, he runs, not very successfully. He only wins, I think, 2 states, doesn't do all that well, and then promptly dies, like, within 6 months of the election. And then Lincoln wins, and he wins without even being on a single ballot in the South. There is not a single state that you can even legally vote for Lincoln in. And that kind of, again, is sort of, again, yeah, that's one of the things that people are thinking about here. Because one of the ideas being that, the North now has such a large population that this guy who is not even on our ballots can win. That what even is our point in voting if we can't really if this guy gets elected without our vote? That is also, again, part of it. Again, that idea of, hey, the federal government, the North, is becoming more powerful politically. There's a lot more immigration in the North. Population's growing in the North. So you do start to see them having more political power. So that fear that the Northerners, and again, many of them equate to being abolitionists, are going to come into power and they're going to end slavery and there's nothing we can do about it. That is the crux of it. It's not just Lincoln getting elected, because again, Lincoln himself is not an abolitionist. He's somebody who says, hey, if we keep the country together with slavery, fine. If we don't keep the country together with slavery, that's fine. He's a moderate. That's the reason he's chosen, because ultimately they were trying to pick William Seward. He was the one they wanted to be the Secretary of State, or the president. He was the Secretary of State under Lincoln, but he is more radical. He's ticked off a lot more people. Lincoln never really had too much of a reputation beyond this, besides the spot resolutions, but nobody really cared about that at the time. But it does give him sort of the opportunity saying, hey, I am a moderate, I'm not a conservative Republican, I'm not a more radical Republican, I'm willing to work with you. But even though saying that, yeah, he might be all right, But what happens to the next guy? Because if we have an election in 1864, nothing's changed, and again, another Republican wins again, who's to say that he's going to be as moderate as Lincoln? And that is something that ultimately does drive a lot of their decision to secede. Not so much fear of Lincoln, but fear of what Lincoln represents, and maybe the policies that either he or future Republican candidates who get elected without any say from the South might do to the South. Primarily, again, relating to their fear of the ending of slavery. That is the drive of all of this, but it does relate very much to what Lincoln represents, this new political shift that comes with the formation of the Republican Party.
Yeah, talk about election fraud. I mean, can you imagine if Trump wasn't even on the ballot in the South, or Biden wasn't even on the ballot in the South? That's insane. But Lincoln was clearly adamant. He has this historical narrative of being a staunch abolitionist, I think, but he had clearly said, you know, I don't mean to touch slavery in the South. My priority is keeping the Union together. And he even expressed some questionable things on African Americans, but that's beside the issue. He said he didn't want to touch slavery in the South. He wanted to keep the Union together. Their main issue was just stopping the spread of slavery, which is obviously completely justified. But another alternate history question. I'm sorry for throwing these curveballs at you, but I love it so much. What do you think would happen if Lincoln had lost the election?
That is a good question. So, I guess it doesn't just depends on who wins if Lincoln doesn't.
Say whoever the runner up was say they won the election. I think it was John Bell, you said.
Then that would probably be Breckinridge, I would say. Breckinridge would probably have won. Breckinridge, interesting personality, kind of comes from wealth. He would probably have been obviously he would have been very much a pro-Southern president. He probably would have tried, my guess, since they knew how tense the issue got over slavery, he probably would have attempted to implement an amendment that would have, that probably would have federally protected slavery. I feel like that's something that he would have done, and since that so many people were worried about the fact that the Union was about to collapse, I feel like more people probably would have been in support of that than they would have before. Abolitionists, of course, would be losing their minds, but I do feel that he would have tried to implement it, and there's a possibility that it could have been added, at least maybe a federal law protecting slavery where it was. Maybe not the expansion of slavery, but I feel like he probably could have gotten an amendment saying that the South, where it already exists, is codified. Maybe popular sovereignty, though, of course, that doesn't necessarily work out too well in the grand scheme of things, but I feel like he would have tried to go in that direction. Again, I don't think the South would have seceded right away. I think he would have tried to prevent that however he could, but I feel like in some ways he would have protected slavery for a lot longer than it would have existed, I would argue.
And who knows, maybe the abolitionists would have seceded because they would have been so outraged at an amendment like that. And who knows if secession would have even happened, how long slavery would have prolonged and maybe led to a slave rebellion. There's so many different variants that could have happened at this time period. You know, what if the South won the Civil War, things like that. But you mentioned earlier you wanted to flesh out how there were pro-union people in the South and pro-secession or pro-slavery people in the North. So I'd like to give you the floor now to flesh out your argument there.
Well, one of the things that we don't really think about is the fact that there were still slaves in the North right up to 1860. Again, they were tended to be very old. I believe there were, sort of the number I always kind of go with, I think there were like 8 elderly slaves in New Jersey in 1860. Because many of those states had implemented gradual emancipation. So, you're not going to be free, but your kids will be. So that is one of the things that, it's not sort of an anti-slave society versus a slave society. They both still had slaves, it's just one of them based their entire society around it. The other one is slowly dying out. There's always this idea, comes up a lot, I think it's either a historical or anthropological concept of society with slaves versus slave society. A society with slaves tends to be what people think about when they think of like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, where slavery was a form of labor. Sometimes you could become free, you could get yourself out of it. It was not necessarily a permanent thing. It was just another form of labor that you could enter in. Usually you were captured in conflict, that sort of thing. But then there's the difference of a slave society, which is where everything in society exists to protect slavery. The banks exist to provide money for the plantation owners. The railroad exists to transport cotton grown by slaves. Like, everything exists to prop it up. So that's one of the things that you do see, again, not very many slaves still in the North, but there are some. And that's something that I think is often forgotten about. Because, again, we like to say, oh, they were all pro-Northern, pro-free. But there are a lot of people in the North who are in favor of slavery, or at least do not care enough to get rid of it. One of the main people that I think about when I think about this is George McClellan, who, famous general, sort of the first leading general of the Union armies. Excellent, really good at training soldiers, really good at making them a strong fighting force, really bad at actually using them. I always felt that he kind of got a little too attached to a lot of his troops, doesn't want to send them out. He always constantly overestimates how big the Confederate numbers are, messes up a lot. Luke gets sort of kicked out of power, comes back into power. Lincoln and he have a huge falling out, have a huge debate. And then in 1864, he runs against Lincoln. Like, he becomes a presidential candidate. And he is a presidential candidate who is running as a Democrat in the North. He is the person that says, I just want the country to go back together. We need to reach out to the South immediately, accept their terms, let them keep slavery. That's what we should do. We need to end this war right now. And he got a lot of support. Again, he doesn't win, but there are a lot of people who are getting very fed up with the way that Lincoln's conducting this. Again, a lot of people aren't invested in this. They always say that Civil War, like a lot of wars, is a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. The average guy on the street doesn't really care about slavery. You know, if he asks this guy, like the small farmer from Ohio, he doesn't care. He has to fight because he's told to. So a lot of people start to become very fed up with this. And I think it does show, if you look at the numbers that McClellan pulls, I mean, it's not enough to win, but it shows that there are a lot of people in the North who are willing to accept the South's terms, that they are willing to come to grips with that to protect slavery, to protect the Union. And I think that is, again, really telling, because, again, that's not the story that people tell you very often. You don't hear that. But it does speak to the complexity of this issue. The idea that, again, John Bell, really popular in the South right before secession happened. George McClellan, really popular in the North. And it does lead to sort of a more nuanced understanding of this, because a lot of people felt that if we accept the South's terms, then all of the sacrifices we've made have been for nothing. That's what they said. It'd be the same thing as surrendering. So that's one of the reasons why he doesn't do as well as he could have. But he does do very well for sort of a Northern Democrat when the other half of the Democratic Party is literally gone. Like, they are gone out of the country. But he still does fairly well. Wins a couple states, I think. But ultimately, again, Lincoln still wins. They follow the war through. Lincoln's victory in that 1864 election is the thing that guarantees that the war will be fought till its conclusion. Especially because by the time you get to the 1864 election, the South's already kind of on its last legs almost by that point anyway, militarily. So a lot of people didn't think it made sense to sort of accept their terms when they were already kind of on the run, sort of against the ropes, if you will. So, but he does do very well, and it does show that the average person, maybe in the North, not as big of a fan, doesn't really care about the conflict, just want their sons home, is kind of the idea that a lot of people really have here.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it really does speak to the nuance and the complexity of this. But something that I don't think is as nuanced, and that I don't understand why there's such a difficult conversation here about the reason for secession, is the South and the secessionists literally told us why they were seceding in their articles of secession. So can you just explain to me what the South and the secessionists were saying in these articles of secession, the reasons they were giving for why they were doing this?
And again, most of it is we are afraid that the North's going to come in and tell us what we can do with our slaves. That is the long and short of it. One famous quote that I like to pull from, because it is from Alexander Stephens, who is the vice president of the Confederacy. Kind of forgotten, largely. He doesn't really do a whole lot when it comes to the Confederate government, but he does have this one line where I'm sure I'm going to get the wording wrong, so I'll be paraphrasing it. He says that the Confederacy is based on the core idea of the superiority of the white man over the black. that is what he says almost sort of word for word. He says that it is inherently designed to be a white supremacist government. That is the reason it exists. That is the reason it is formed. Of course, after the war is over, he's like, oh, it was never about slavery. It was never about any of that. Of course, completely changes their tune, just like these secession commissioners who went around telling everybody, secede to protect your slaves. And it does, again, sort of really speak to the moment. And again, like you said, the sort of the history of revolutions is really important here for a lot of this because, again, major event that happens not even in the United States, but really impacts the American institution of slavery is the Haitian Revolution. Because it is a slave rebellion that overthrows and creates its own government. That is the doomsday scenario for a lot of these Southern slaveholders. And they're afraid that Lincoln comes into power, slaves will either have an uprising, or that ultimately, the North's going to free them. We're going to have a slave uprising. The big thing is they want to promote white supremacy, but they're afraid the moment that slaves are freed that they will become black supremacy, that they will be treated the same way that they've treated slaves for the last 150 years, 200 years. That's the big fear. They don't want the role reversal. And so much of it, again, comes down to, again, sort of the ideas of gender is still a big part of this. It's always we have to protect our women. There is the idea that inherently, unfortunately, the sort of racist belief at the time is that black men were considered to be sort of essentially rapists. That is how they framed them. They said that they are interested in white women. If they are freed, they will come after you and they will assault your daughters. That is the big fear. That is something they write about, they talk about it, and it drives a lot of the interactions between white and black in the South up until the 60s. Like, that is a continuous threat that they're always afraid of. This sort of racial mixing is the thing that really terrifies them. And they can't possibly fathom that a white woman might find a black man attractive. They can't fathom that in their minds, despite the fact that many white slave owners have children with their female slaves. Like, that is a common thing. Everybody knew it. The wives wrote it in their diaries, like, yeah, I saw my husband's other kid today, but they just didn't talk about it. But the thing is, the idea that if it's reversed, oh, nobody could ever see that as a possibility. So, and that comes up to it, like, oftentimes women, when they were the 1920s, they often say, like, oh, they get caught having a consensual relationship. They say, oh, it was assault, guy gets killed. Like, that is the fact of the matter. It comes down to this racial purity idea, particularly of protecting white women. That is one of the things, of course, they tap into. That's one of the reasons they say they're doing this. We're protecting the children, we're protecting the women. And of course, they're protecting themselves in the process, but that is the way that they tend to frame it so that they can morally justify what they're doing. Because that is the whole thing. Again, these are people who consider themselves to be Christians. They consider themselves to be devout, God-fearing men and women. They say the Bible condones slavery. They say that God likes this system. And they often say that God is on our side because God loves slavery. That is what they say. And then when the war ends, they say that, why has God kind of abandoned us? That is one of the things a lot of them feel. So in some ways, that religious turmoil that they do feel here ends up leading into their decisions to embrace the lost cause, something that gives them meaning in a world that seemingly doesn't have one anymore. It's, in some ways, again, it's a civil religion, as people have described it. There's a book by Charles Reagan Wilson, great book called Baptized in Blood. It kind of talks about this idea from a religious perspective. And it's a really interesting angle, again, sort of that they have to believe this because otherwise it means that God sort of has turned his back on them. And there was even one document I read when I was doing my dissertation where it literally says, I think God has punished us for our sins of slavery. I think he has punished us for this. And that was written by a white Southern man. He said that I think this is our punishment for what we have done. And that is a level of awareness that gradually is lost through the dominance of the lost cause that sort of is designed to make people not question what they've done, that we are the good guys here. That is one of the main driving factors for why the lost cause exists, and that's one of the main reasons why it continues to be propagated through a lot of, even today, it's still a very large part of the overall discussion of the legacy of the Confederacy. It's inherently rooted in that idea of how do we protect our legacies, protect our reputations? How can we look at ourselves in the mirror knowing what we've done? Because the idea is might makes right, and their might didn't. And that makes them realize maybe we were wrong. They start questioning themselves, and they can't have that. So they create this as a defense mechanism to protect them from the embracement of nihilism. Not necessarily nihilism, but sort of fatalism, I guess, if you will. They become very fatalistic in their outlook, and the lost cause is a panacea to that.
Yeah, so basically, the secessionists tell us that we need to protect the institution of slavery, white man is superior, which completely contradicts and coincides with the founding principles of the nation, the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, all men are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I don't know where that got lost in translation, but I know you're not a constitutional lawyer, but what is the constitutionality of all of this? What does the Constitution say about secession? Were they constitutionally justified, or was this a complete violation of the Constitution?
That is really the question. That is the question they've always debated. And I think that goes down to the different understandings of the Constitution and what the Constitution means. So there are two strains of thought that exist even today. Again, this is still a continuing debate in politics. I always try to make those connections to today to show that, history is not just in the past. It still impacts everything we do. One of the main things that I think drives a lot of this is the idea of strict constructionist versus loose constructionist. The strict constructionists believe that unless it is explicitly listed in the powers of the Constitution, the federal government does not have the right to do it. This is primarily the Southern approach to this. It's the approach that Jefferson takes a lot, except for, again, one very specific instance, as you previously mentioned, where he says, there's nothing in the Constitution that says the United States can buy land from a foreign country. But I want to do it anyway. So he, again, completely switches around, doesn't make any sense, very inconsistent, but he buys Louisiana Purchase, which, according to his own beliefs, he is legally not justified to do. And that is a violation of strict constructionism, which is his whole thing. But again, he does it because he wants to get more land for the institution of slavery. And the loose constructionists, they're the ones that believe that if it is not mentioned in the Constitution, then it is more up for debate. So for a lot of these Southerners, because there's nothing in the Constitution that says you cannot secede, they felt they had the justification to do so. Very much a strict understanding. While the loose constructionists, that are tended to be more popular in the North, they say that it is more nuanced than that. It is a breathing, living document. It can change, it can alter, the different circumstances are being, as different things come up, they couldn't predict every single thing that is going to become a political issue. So a lot of them have deliberately worded things in a vague manner. Because again, these guys are lawyers. They want to be able to create loopholes if need be. And these loose constructionists are, in a way, using those loopholes in the Constitution to argue for who has the right to do things. While the strict constructionists are very literally minded that, hey, it is not listed in there, it is a power of the state. So that becomes the big debate. Again, that is the crux of the discussion over whether secession can be legally justified. Of course, after the Civil War ended, we know it's not really constitutional. But at the time, it was something of a debate. And people could have very nuanced understandings of it based off of their interpretation of whether they are a strict constructionist or a loose constructionist. And I think that, again, one of the major debates of politics at the time, one of the major debates of politics today, it still comes back to, do we take it literally, or do we allow for some of the vagueness of the document to be able to apply it in different circumstances? And ultimately, that is the political issue that does create secession, combined with nullification, combined with fear of slavery loss. That is the thing that does create this ultimate fear. This fear of losing slaves and that justification that we are right in doing this, I think, is sort of the general idea of sort of the constitutionality of it.
Interesting. So even after all this time, it's still a little foggy on whether it was constitutional, or can you definitively say yes or no?
I mean, that would be entirely in my personal opinion. I don't believe it was constitutional, because I'm more of a loose constructionist myself. But I think, there is a more nuanced debate to it, I think, than what people say. But again, sort of the Civil War has officially kind of ended that debate when it comes to secession. At least the idea of strict literally interpreting the Constitution or allowing sort of for that vagueness of it is still something that comes up in politics all the time when it comes especially to the relationship between the federal government and the states. So again, it is more nuanced, but I think the Civil War has finally clarified that, although the idea of loose versus strict is still a major theme in politics, again, and probably will never go away. As long as the Constitution exists as it exists, I'm sure that this is going to continue to be a breathing document that can be interpreted in different ways, depending on people's political opinions, what they believe, the power of the federal versus the power of the state, I think is kind of the heart of it.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I mean, just if you look at it logically, why would the drafters of the Constitution, who were trying to create a strong, unified federal government, why would they put in a clause or anything like that that allowed the Union to be broken up and split and, ununified? So that, when I look at it, that's kind of what I see. I'm just trying to look at it logically. Like, why would the founders allow for secession and splitting up the Union if they're trying to create a strong government, a strong nation? But to play devil's advocate here, the American Revolution, you could technically justify as a secession. They were seceding from the British Empire. So could you perhaps say that secession was justified because America was founded on a secession?
See, that is the thing that a lot of the Confederates honestly believe. Like, that comes up. They often would say that, hey, we are the true inheritors of the American Revolution. We are the ones who are rejecting tyranny. That is what they thought they were doing. So in some ways, they were actively making that comparison at the time. And of course, the North was as well, saying that we are the true successors of the Revolution. There's a lot to be said about how history is used in justification, making those comparisons, because at the time, people are doing that. They are making those comparisons. Again, sort of, it is in some ways a secession, a breaking away, creating of a separate nation, absolutely. But I think that is kind of a lot of times where it sort of the comparison ends. But again, the Confederates absolutely believe that. There is a reason why oftentimes they try to claim that there were 13 Southern states, even though there were only 11 Confederate states. They always try and throw 2 more in there because, hey, 13 Confederate states, 13 original states. Like, hey, look, we are the true successors to the Revolution. Again, I don't buy that myself, but that is actual logic that they used when they were doing this. Like, I've read the documents. They specifically say that. So I think it is a really interesting argument that I think they're making, but it's one that I sort of fundamentally reject because it is a different situation simply because of the existence of the Constitution as opposed to the more colonial power that comes from being a colony to a nation. Because the South, even if they may have thought of it as such, they were not really considered a colony. They were on more equal terms. So it would be more of a secession as opposed to a breaking away, the creation of a new country in that same sense. But again, they do really draw comparisons themselves, saying we are the revolutionary generation reborn. And I think that is a really interesting use of history to sort of justify what they do. They are not, again, people often say, oh, they were unintelligent. No, these are very smart men. They're just very smart men in a way that sort of utilizes that in a very different way. They're using history to push their political goals. I mean, everybody sort of does that, but they are sort of not, they are aware of American history. They are aware of the legacy of the United States, and they bring that into their discussions. Again, it's easy to write them off saying, oh, they were all sort of, backwoods people who want to leave this union. And that's not even the case. These are some of the smartest men in American history to some extent. And it becomes, like I said, it's so much more complicated than people really want to think about it. Because if you think about all the nuances and complexities of it, you could quite literally go insane. It's one of the reasons why Civil War, literature on the Civil War is like a third of the history section when you look at bookstores. Like, people have been trying to grapple with this for a very, very long time. hundreds of years already, like literally over 150 years, I think, almost. So like it is crazy.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's so much literature written on the Civil War, and I think it's probably, if you look at it, the most air quotes popular aspect of American history that most people gravitate towards.
That and World War II. World War II is the only other thing that could give it a.
Right, for sure. Definitely World War II because of the, just the massive scale and the way it changed the world. But anyway, it's so interesting to look at, like you said, when people use history to justify their political means, because you see that all of the time. Every side of the aisle, every argument, every political party uses a little snippet or piece of history to justify what they're doing. I think there's a lot to be said there, and that could be a whole other podcast episode or conversation just about that aspect alone, because there's just so many instances of it. But it is really different because the American Revolution, we seceded from a colonial empire that was a monarchy an ocean away, and in the Civil War, we already had a constitutional republic, a constitutional government. We were neighbors. We all had equal means in that government, despite what the Southerners thought, that the North controlled the government and they would ultimately be ruled out on every issue. But that's how our government works. That's the structure of our government. But looking back at all of this, there seems to be two different historical narratives between the North and the South on the Civil War and the issue of secession and all this. So can you just explain to me the difference over time about the different narratives that you see in the North and South and how propaganda plays a role in all of this?
Yeah, I think the main idea, again, sort of goes back to the lost cause. That becomes the main narrative. The North, for a while, they're trying to get their own interpretation of the ideas into the books as well. They are trying to do that, but ultimately they realize, a lot of these businessmen particularly, they start to realize that if they want to make the most amount of money possible, they want to sell their books to the South as well. So they decide to pick a side. They pick the Southern side, and the North, again, sort of, yeah, whatever, we won, they lost, it doesn't really matter, we'll let them have whatever makes them feel better. That kind of becomes the attitude of this, because they said we want to move beyond it. We want to sort of bridge the bloody chasm. We want to clasp hands across the bloody chasm, as I believe they said. So they are more willing to accept the Southern ideology becoming the prevalent ideology, the prevalent narrative, simply to not have to reopen those wounds. Even though for the Confederacy, they are actively, sort of these neo-Confederates are actively reopening the wounds, but a lot of Northerners just choose to ignore it because they said sort of like, we got to put that behind us, we got to move on, we have more important things to focus on. Again, the 1890s, Reconstruction's over. They're focusing on their own things now. And ultimately, they just sort of step back. Businessmen start making collaborations. These printing houses make collaborations with Southern schools. And they start creating books that cater to the South. And the North gets them as well. So it becomes the dominant narrative of the entire conflict for almost 100 years. It becomes the way that people remember the Civil War.
It seems that throughout time, it's like we've talked about throughout this conversation, it's gotten pretty black and white. We're the good guys, you're the bad guys, we were right, you're wrong, that sort of thing. But an opinionated question for you, feel free to share your opinion. It's completely open here. What are your thoughts on Confederate monuments and the flying of the Confederate flag?
Yeah, good questions. There's a lot written on this. This is actually one, I have a whole chapter in my dissertation that kind of focuses on these questions. I think there are multiple phases to the creation of Confederate monuments. There is the initial building phase that comes up a lot, sort of set in graveyards. That's where the monuments are initially created to honor the Confederate dead. That is primarily where they start. But over time, they start to become more and more prevalent in more and more central areas. And oftentimes, again, I can't really go into all the details because it is something in my dissertation, but they do serve a political purpose. They serve a purpose of sort of re-establishing the power of the Democratic Party in areas where it was a little bit more debated. There were areas of sort of during the 1880s, 1890s, where the Democrats are not doing so well in some places. So these monuments become kind of a extension of trying to become, to be able to sort of reassert power in a time period where they're afraid that they may be losing their edge. That does have a lot to do with it. There was an incident of one monument that I did a sort of a case study on, focusing on people were really, really upset about the fact that one state had a monument for a guy who died in the Spanish-American War, but didn't have a monument for a guy who died in the Civil War. So they spent like 3 years trying to raise the money to get this monument built, to sort of show he was a Southern martyr dying for the Confederacy. So I think that's really interesting because they become much more centralized. They become put in like central areas, courthouses, and that is to, in a way, saying we are continuing the legacy of these individuals. I think that's kind of the sort of the core of the issue with a lot of the monuments. But also the Confederate flag is another really interesting symbol here. And something that comes up a lot when I'm teaching quite often, because there are, again, a lot of states say, yeah, it's about my heritage, you go, Southern heritage. And yeah, I would be able to sort of buy that argument to some extent, but the resurgence of the Confederate battle flag in particular occurs in the 1960s. And it occurs during the Civil Rights Movement. That's when, again, it had been used again, but it had always specifically meant the Confederacy. Yeah, the Confederacy fought for slavery, so yeah, it always kind of had that negative connotation to some way to some people, particularly African Americans, never really liked it. But when you look at the 1960s, you see people waving it explicitly to show their opposition to desegregation. That's where it becomes much more openly political. I mean, it's always been political. It is the representation of a government that fought for slavery, but they start waving it to show that we do not agree with what the federal government is doing regarding desegregating our schools. There are literally instances of schools that are being ordered to desegregate, and Virginia cuts off their charter. Like, that school closes because they would rather not let their people have a school than let the people have to go to an integrated school. So they start waving the Confederate flags to sort of show their opposition to this civil rights movement for African Americans. That's why you see it start being flown over courthouses. Again, it is literally incorporated into the Georgia state flag for a while to show opposition to the civil rights movement. And that's where it gets its much more modern negative political connotation. Again, a lot of people will look at it and say, yeah, this represents sort of Southern heritage, of course. But to a lot of other people, again, particularly African Americans, it represents people who literally use that as a symbol to show that you are not welcome. So it becomes a very, again, nuanced, complicated political debate over what it represents, what it means, and everybody's going to have different opinions on that. But I don't think the people who are sort of saying that this is a flag that sort of represents hate in a way, they're not entirely, they're not in the wrong necessarily, because in some ways that is what it came to be during the 1960s. And it's hard to sort of separate it from that legacy of the 60s and the legacy of the 1860s. It's hard to sort of separate that for a lot of people. Some people can do it no problem, but a lot of people are not willing to do that because that brings up very bad memories of sort of the idea of the Confederacy and particularly opposition to civil rights, I would say. So those are one of the reasons why they may remain so controversial in a lot of ways. It is kind of a really sort of an interesting, again, continuing point, and again in politics, because this stuff doesn't go away. Like, it continues and will continue to be a prevalent debate in politics for a while. And it is something that, again, there is more nuances to it, but it is, I can't really disagree with people who say, like, you know, best represents what happened in the 1960s. I definitely understand their trepidation sort of around it, because in many ways it represents sort of people who inherently believe that you are inferior, particularly for African Americans. And I think more and more people are beginning to accept that idea as well. Of course, there are always people who don't see it as that, and that's, I guess in that way it sort of makes sense to them. But it continues to sort of, as every day goes by, more and more people start to see it as a symbol of sort of opposition, to resist the thing. Particularly because the 1960s, it was also the idea not just desegregation, but the fact that the federal government was arguing and pushing for desegregation, and they're saying that the federal government doesn't have the right to do that, so that's why the Confederate symbol comes up again. They start using it again, their knowledge of history, to make those connections, to say, hey, this is the exact same thing that the Confederates fought for. They're fighting for their rights to not let a federal government come in and tell them what to do. But again, it still comes down to federal government telling them not to have slavery, federal government telling them to not have segregation. It continues to recur in these same instances. There's a lot of times where the federal government comes in, tells them to do things like, that they don't necessarily agree with, but the Confederate flag doesn't really come up then. It's only when it comes around these issues of race that they continue to bring that as a political symbol. I think when it comes to sort of the idea that the federal government is coming in and pushing us on us something that we don't like, particularly when it comes to sort of upsetting the racial hierarchy, that's when the flags start to come out, and one of the reasons why it has its more negative connotation today.
Yeah, it's such a complicated, nuanced issue, almost more so than the issue of secession itself. But it seems that it was sort of a reactionary force of opposition to the civil rights movement, like you mentioned, the resurgence of it, at least. And we can clearly condemn any sort of instance where the Confederate flag is used in a position of hate or to push a political rhetoric that's rooted in racism or anything like that. Clearly condemnable, not justifiable in any way. But I think if you ask the majority of Americans what they think when they see a Confederate flag, they instantly say hate, racism, slavery, things like that. But there is a side to this that comes from a position of, Southern honor and Southern heritage and Southern remembrance, because like we mentioned, not everyone who fought in the Confederacy was, adamantly racist and pro-slavery and had slaves. There are a large aspect of this that's just rooted in remembering heritage. My ancestors fought in the Confederacy. I'm proud of my heritage. They didn't own slaves or anything like that. But is it possible to separate the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments from slavery and racism to just remember and honor heritage? Or are they inseparable in that sense? Because obviously they're used for hate a lot of times, and I want to condemn that very clearly. But I think there are instances where you can use the Confederate flag as a symbol of your heritage when there's no ill will meant towards anyone.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that's something that is up more to sort of, it's much more like a personal choice, I guess, personal approach there, sort of an individualistic one, because I don't think it's possible really to do it on a grand scale anymore. I think as more people become aware sort of the legacy of the Confederacy, it becomes harder for people to make that separation. And I think that is, again, people can obviously use it for heritage and say that is their heritage, but they also kind of have to deal with the way that may look to other people who don't see it that way. And, I mean, if they're willing, I guess, to make that concession, that's, I guess, sort of up to them, but it is, again, so much more complicated. So because, again, I have Southern heritage. I love the South. I literally live in the South. Wonderful people, great food. So I understand that for sure, but the symbology of it is something that's just sort of hard to get behind for me personally, and I think again, sort of like you said, the majority of people will see it in that way. So it's all up to the individual person if they're willing to sort of grapple with that. And of course, that can't be made up by anybody else. That is a sort of an individual choice that people have to decide. But I do see sort of the complexity of it, and it is very nuanced. But sort of for me personally, I can't really sort of make that separation because I am a Confederate historian. Like, I study the Confederacy. It's hard for me to see it as anything other than a symbol of the Confederacy. But for people who are not as invested in the history of it, I can see why they would not see it that way. But I think they should be open more towards the conversations that will prompt. Because they can't sort of, it will oftentimes lead to sort of a feeling of vitriol. But I think there are some nuanced conversations to be had if people are willing to have that conversation but I think there's really no way to sort of, at least to me anyway, to kind of continue to make that separation myself.
Yeah, being open to conversation, I think, is very important, and that's something we lack very much so in today's society. Is people aren't really open to conversation, very much so rooted in their beliefs and their biases, and it's completely understandable that it's seen as a symbol of slavery and racism and hatred by African Americans. That's completely understandable and justified, but it's unfortunate that proponents of the lost cause and people of Confederate descent use it as a symbol of hate, because it's just further tarnishing the symbol and the legacy, and further cementing this rhetoric of hate. And it's unfortunate because you're just painting a bad picture for yourself. You're not helping the situation in any way.
Right. And it create in some ways does paint a sort of negative perception of the South, which again, South is great. I love the South. I love the people of the South. And I'm always one of the first people out there who are trying to defend sort of Southern people, sort of Southern culture. Obviously not the racial parts, but sort of the Southern culture. Because again, there are a lot of African Americans in the South. I love African Americans in the South as well. Like, they are included in that. And I think it is such a beautiful region, great literary tradition, great cultural tradition, food. I love all of that. And I think that sort of this continued focus on sort of Confederate ideology, Confederate symbology, things like that, does continue to paint a negative picture to people who are not in the South. Because often people, even today, will say, it's like, oh, that's a backward region, it's all this stuff. And, I mean, living in the South, I don't see that. But that is the way that it looks to people who are not here, simply because of that complicated history that I think. Because, again, people don't think about the segregation, the housing segregation that happened in the North. That happened there, too. But it's not spoken about because it's not as open. In some ways, because it's not as open, it's also very insidious in some ways. But it is, again, like I said, it's so much more nuanced than that. And I think that by sort of focusing on the history of the South solely in those terms, it really, again, makes it a black and white region. And that's not the case. It is a nuanced place. Again, yeah, there are issues in the South, there are issues in the North, there are issues everywhere. But I think that there's a lot more to it that are often overlooked when it comes down to the discussions of, obviously, sort of race, class, things like that, which, again, those are all very important and they should be studied. I study them myself. I find them compelling. But there is more to it than that. And it's very hard to sort of fight against again, historical narratives. It's always one of those things that I'm trying to sort of fight against the lost cause, fight against negative perceptions of places. That's one of the things, sort of fighting against stereotypes. That's something that I always want to do with my work. Sort of this anti-racist, I guess, anti-stereotype, kind of showing the nuances of people. Because again, people are not one thing. They are multifaceted. It's so easy to look at George Washington, oh yeah, George Washington, beloved dude. When he ran as president, his approval rating was really bad for his second term. It's like you don't think about that. The idea, there's a book I read about sort of this idea of the big man of history idea. That, we talk about these great people in history, and in talking about their greatness, we strip away the stuff that makes them interesting. Again, the fact, Jefferson, interesting guy, really complicated views on slavery. And you can't really separate the two, because that is what makes him interesting. Focusing solely on the good presents a very boring depiction of people. Focusing solely on the bad creates a very boring depiction of people. It is nuanced. They are three-dimensional people. And I think that is something that, me as a historian myself, that's something that I fully believe in. Trying to, again, push narratives and sort of undertaking the deconstruction of some of these complicated, harmful narratives in some ways, and showing that, history is made of people. It's not set in stone. It's not monolithic. That the choices that an individual make can shape history. That's one of the things I always bring up to my students in class, that students, they have knowledge, they have the ability, they can go out there and change the world. Sometimes may not seem like it, but people have the capacity to do wonderful things. But they have to sort of be aware of where we come from. I always say that, in my classes, that history is something that is still happening. that if you look at the world we are in today, it is book 7 in an ongoing series. And you can't just sit down and read book 7 and have any understanding of what's going on. That you have to truly understand America, to truly understand the world today, even especially this year, it's an election year. It's important to understand how we got to where we are. My job as a professor, as a lecturer, is to get them caught up. So that way when they do go out and vote, when they do go out to change the world, they do so with a more nuanced understanding of how we got here. Because, again, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does sometimes rhyme. And I think the best way to be able to sort of be aware of those issues is to be an informed person. It's one of the reasons, it's one of the things I always focus on, try to make those comparisons to today, because this is not something that just happened in the past. We're constantly coming up with new ways of thinking about things. Yeah, the information may not change, but we develop new cultural ways and new understandings of the past. And looking at the past is important, sort of understanding the nuances, looking at it through gender, race, class, identity. Those are all things that are really sort of cutting edge right now. How people perceive of themselves in history, and being able to make those comparisons to help get people caught up to the present moment, I think is one of the main things that I do. That's what drives me. That's one of my sort of the passions, is to give them the ability to go out and make a positive change in the world. Because the world always needs positive attitudes, positive change. And I think that the best way to do that is by becoming informed. Becoming somebody who is aware of what's come before, so that you do not make the same mistakes that people in the past have made. And maybe learn to see what works, what doesn't work, and make the world a better place. Because you can't sort of separate the present moment from what's come before.
Wow. That's so beautifully said. I mean, you need to clip that speech and make that, your life's motto, because that was beautifully said. I actually had a guest on a couple of weeks ago. It was probably one of my favorite podcast episodes I did, Jason Voyevich, about the consumer revolution in the 1920s. And he said the same thing. He said, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And it's so true. I mean, it's a beautiful saying. And I like to say, study the past so you can understand the present and conceptualize the future. It's so important to study the past, know where we come from, know the truth of it, look through the fogginess of it all. But I love the South. I'm from the South. I'm from Florida. I know a lot of people don't consider that the South. I do. Southern hospitality. There's a beautiful Southern culture. We all have our dark aspects of history, but it's a beautiful culture down here. And you're right, though. It is individualistic. Everyone's going to have their individual symbols and views, but especially when it comes to the Confederate flag and the Confederate monuments, it's very difficult, dare I say impossible, to separate on a grand scale, the dark history of it from anyone using it for Southern heritage or anything like that. But that's a beautiful place to wrap up on that wonderful monologue you just gave. I think this is the longest podcast episode I've ever done, and I'm so glad you could join me, because I've always been interested in why the South seceded. I've never actually got around to diving deep into the research, diving into the literature, and actually understanding why. So you coming on has given me the incentive to finally answer this question for myself, and I have done so. So Joshua, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This was wonderful.
All right, appreciate it. You have a wonderful day. Glad I really enjoyed it.